Mrs. Tuttle, Mrs. Tuttle, Mrs. Tuttle, she likes to cuddle. Likes to cuddle, Mrs. Tuttle, Mrs. Tuttle likes to cuddle, Mrs. Cuddle, Mrs. Tuttle, she likes to cuddle. She's a chem teach, not a preach, but a chem teach, chem teach, chem teacher. She's a chem teach, not to preach, but to preach. Prissy Patty, sissy catty, Prissy Patty and Sissy Catty, Prissy Patty and Sissy Catty. Mrs. Tuttle, Mrs. Tuttle likes to cuddle. Cuddle, she's a chem teach, likes to preach. She's a chem teach, likes to preach. Likes to sell, cell phone. And she says, cell phone. Mrs. Tuttle, she likes to cuddle. Mrs. Tuttle, she likes to cuddle. Mrs. Tuttle, she likes to cuddle. She's a chem teach, not a preach, chem teach, chemistry, teacher, not a preacher, chem teach, not a preach, Prissy Patty, sissy catty, Sissy Catty. Likes to say no, likes to say cell phone, and no. And you can blame your favorite students. Blame your favorite students, Zach and Travis. You can blame Zach and Travis for this song. Mrs. Tuttle, blame Zach and Travis. Blame Zach and Travis, your favorite students. Fave your fave students. Fave your fave students. Zach and Travis likes to say cell phone and say no. You can blame Zach and Travis, cell phone and no. Mrs. Tuttle likes to cuddle. Mrs. Tuttle likes to cuddle. Mrs. Tuttle likes to cuddle.